In the 6th year, in the 6th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I sat in my house, with the elders of Judah sitting before me, the hand of the Lord God fell upon me there, that I looked, and behold, a form that had the appearance of a man. Below what appeared to be his waist was fire, and above his waist was something like the appearance of brightness, like gleaming metal. He put out the form of a hand and took me by a lock of my head, and the Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven and brought me in visions of God to Jerusalem, to the entrance of the gateway of the inner court that faces north, where was the seat of the image of jealousy, which provokes to jealousy. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel was there, like the vision that I saw in the valley. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Worship wars. That's how some have characterized the last several decades of rather strong disagreements when it comes to the content and the style of Christian worship in many churches. At first glance, it might seem a little over the top to call disagreements about what kinds of music and practices a congregation decides to use in its worship services wars, until you realize that people get very, very emotionally invested in the particular understanding of what worship should look like on Sunday morning. Some prefer hymns and a pipe organ. Others prefer contemporary praise songs and guitars. And some prefer time-honored liturgies. Others prefer innovation. Some prefer all things to be done decently and in order. Others prefer almost absolute spontaneity. And if two groups of people don't see eye to eye when it comes to those preferences, there's the very real possibility of all-out war. Well, you might be happy to know that today's message is not going to be about the different styles of worship, but it is going to be about what's at the very core of our worship as Christians, regardless of the style. Last week, we looked at chapters 4 and 5, and we saw how the prophet Ezekiel was told by God to do a certain number of sign acts, kind of like acted out parables, all of which pointed to the impending judgment of the house of Israel through the instrument of the Babylonian army. Ezekiel was told to do some pretty bizarre things, which probably caused many of the people around him to snicker and to think that he was crazy. But if they had the spiritual eyes to see, then they would have picked up on the horrifying reality that those sign acts were communicating. The house of Israel, God's own people, had transgressed his law countless times. They had relied on foreign powers instead of relying on God. And most fundamentally, they had allowed their hearts to become cold towards their Lord. The Israelites had pushed God away so many times that God had finally had enough. So as a result of his just wrath towards sin, he would allow the holy city of Jerusalem to fall and his people to be dispersed among the nations. The vast majority of them would know nothing other than hardship for the rest of their lives, if they even survived very long at all. So Ezekiel, at great cost to his own comfort, obediently conveyed all of the signs that God had commanded him to do. And then God had him start proclaiming various oracles of judgment in more of the traditional prophetic way, by simply speaking the words of God to God's people. That's what happens in the chapters that we're skipping today, chapters 6 and 7. And Ezekiel's very simple yet terrifying message to the house of Israel in chapter 7 is that the day of the Lord is soon to arrive. And if you know anything about that phrase, the day of the Lord, as it's used in the Old Testament, then you know that's not a good thing. The day of the Lord is the day of judgment. It's the day of reckoning for the accumulation of generations of sin. And if Ezekiel and the other Israelites still weren't clear as to why the day of judgment was coming, the chapters that we're looking at today make it very clear. And it all has to do with worship. So what I want to do today is to answer two big questions about worship gone wrong. And we have your outline in your bulletin there. Just 2 points. Number one, what is corrupt worship? And number two, what are the consequences of corrupt worship. So Ezekiel starts out this new series of visions that he has by giving us very precise time markers, just as he had in the first chapter. He says again there at the beginning of verse 1, in the 6th year, in the 6th month, on the 5th day of the month. In chapter 1, he had begun his work by writing that the first vision took place in the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin. And now, in chapter 8, he tells us that this is the 6th year, which means that this is a little bit more than a year after God first appeared to him and commissioned him to be a prophet. The scene here at the beginning of the chapter is of Ezekiel in his makeshift hut there on the outskirts of Babylon. And the elders of Judah are gathered there around him, probably to see if he had any new revelations from God. So by this time, it seems that Ezekiel was well known as a prophet among his fellow exiles there on the Kebar Canal. And as he's there in his home, he says that the hand of the Lord fell upon him. In other words, God was now making his presence known as he began to lead Ezekiel into another series of visions. The description of what he first sees there in verse 3 looks pretty much identical to what he saw in the first vision. It's something that's in the likeness of a man, but this man is glowing like gleaming metal. Then Ezekiel is lifted up in the Spirit and taken to Jerusalem, where he will be given visions of what's going on there. And once again, remember that these are visions. These are images that are being given to Ezekiel and no one else. We can think of it as Ezekiel being in something like a waking dream. And as we walk through each of these visions of Jerusalem that he's given in these chapters, it might be helpful to think of it in terms of what you see in a story like Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. I'm pretty sure pretty much everyone has either read the story or seen some kind of film adaptation. My favorite is the Muppets version. And the basic plot of that story is that Scrooge is an old, miserly man who hates everyone, goes around saying bah humbug at Christmas time. But one year he has a transformative experience when he's visited on Christmas Eve by 3 different spirits, the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future. Each of the ghosts appears to Scrooge while he's sleeping. And when he meets them, he's transported, as it were, to various times and places of his past, present, and future, even though his actual body is still lying there in his bed on Christmas Eve. And so if that's not too irreverent, that might be a good way to think about Ezekiel's visions. Following that mode of thought, we can say that the first set of visions that Ezekiel has in chapter 8 are all occurring more or less in the present time. So looking again at verses 3 and 4, we read, "He put out the form of a hand, and he took me by a lock of my head. And the Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven and brought me in visions of God to Jerusalem, to the entrance of the gateway of the inner court that faces north, where was the seat of the image of jealousy, which provokes to jealousy. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel was there, like the vision that I saw in the valley." So if you were watching this played out in movie form, you would see Ezekiel sitting there with the elders in his house, and then it would cut to a wide-angle shot of an ancient city with a caption at the bottom that says, "Meanwhile in Jerusalem." And then you would see Ezekiel suddenly standing there near the entrance of the temple. Well, that's what the inner court refers to there in verse 3. It's the inner court of the temple. And when Ezekiel arrives there in this vision, what he sees first are 2 things that are probably very startling to him, but for very different reasons. He most immediately sees the glory of God, just as he had seen it before. The amazing sight of God's chariot throne hovering there over the temple. Well, that was surely an awe-inspiring sight, but then look what he sees in verses 5 and 6. It says, "Then God said to me, 'Son of man, lift up your eyes now toward the north.' So I lifted up my eyes to the north, and behold, north of the altar gate in the entrance was this image of jealousy. And he said to me, 'Son of man, do you see what they are doing? the great abominations that the house of Israel are committing here to drive me far from my sanctuary, but you will see still greater abominations. What Ezekiel sees there is most basically an idol. We're not given a whole lot of information about what kind of idol this is. It's some kind of statue of wood or stone carving. But what any devout Israelite would know is that something like that has no place in God's holy city. And it most certainly has no place right next to the altar of God's temple. And so right off the bat, we're given a clue here that what Ezekiel is going to see are various images of idolatry that only get more and more heinous as the vision goes on. The first one that he sees is called an image of jealousy. And it says there in verse 3 that it provokes jealousy. And who is the primary one who is provoked to jealousy by this image? Well, it's God. God uses the word abomination, and that is indeed what any kind of image or statue of another god or another creature that is either placed in a sacred space or is actively worshipped is to God. And that sort of thing provokes God's jealousy because God is jealous first and foremost for his own glory. In Isaiah 42, verse 8, God says, I am the Lord, that is my name. My glory I give to no other, nor my praise to carved idols. And then going much further back into Israel's history, the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, it's very clear that God would not tolerate the worship of other so-called gods. God also makes it clear how the Israelites are to confront idol worship when they see it in the land of Canaan. In Exodus 34, he says, you shall tear down their altars and break their pillars and cut down their asherim, for you shall worship no other God, for the Lord, whose name is a jealous God. Now, just as with the word wrath, we might look askance at that word jealous when it applies to God. After all, shouldn't God be above jealousy? Well, if that's how you think of it, I invite you to consider the way in which God often describes his relationship with his people. He makes covenants with his people, and those covenants are not like our modern-day business contracts, purely transactional without the expectation of any kind of personal affection for the other person that we've contracted with. No, what's clear throughout the Bible is that when God makes a covenant, it should be thought of as constituting a committed relationship in which both sides of the covenant are intimately attached to one another. On a purely human level, marriage is the prime example. Marriage is a covenant relationship that was instituted by God. And that's precisely the type of relationship that God often uses as a picture of his relationship with his own people. There's a lot of imagery in both the Old Testament and the New that compares Israel and then later on the church to the bride of God. Now, of course, that's a metaphor because we are also called children of God and sometimes even friends of God. Nonetheless, the metaphor of marriage serves to highlight the covenant that God has made with us as his called out people. And of course, God's original covenant people were the people of Israel. So the reason why God is often said to be a jealous God throughout the Bible is that he, like a jealous husband, does not like it when his bride starts flirting with other men. He wants his bride all to himself. Therefore, God often compares Israel's waywardness and idolatry to adultery. Their rebellion is severing their marriage covenant with God. So God is rightfully provoked to jealousy for his own glory and for his people when they fall into idolatry. Well, let's look now at verses 7 through 13 there in chapter 8. Starting in verse 7, we read, And he brought me to the entrance of the court, and when I looked, behold, there was a hole in the wall. Then he said to me, Son of man, dig in the wall. So I dug in the wall, and behold, there was an entrance. And he said to me, "Go in and see the vile abominations that they are committing here." So I went in and saw, and there, engraved on the wall all around, was every form of creeping things and loathsome beasts, and all the idols of the house of Israel. And before them stood 70 men of the elders of the house of Israel, with Jezaniah the son of Shaphan standing among them. Each had his censer in his hand, and the smoke of the cloud of incense went up. Then he said to me, "Son of man, have you seen what the elders of the house of Israel are doing in the dark, each in his room of pictures? For they say, 'The Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land.' He said also to me, 'You will see still greater abominations that they commit.'" So now the Spirit brings Ezekiel right up to the temple building itself, and then he's told to dig a hole into the wall. And what he finds on the other side of the wall, in the holy place of God, is 70 elders of Israel worshiping various images on the wall, which include creeping things and beasts and other gods, which is language taken straight from God's prohibition of idol worship in the first 2 commandments. So they're in the dark. They're in what seems to be a secret compartment of the temple building. And there is a thick cloud of incense enveloping them, causing this to be a scene of haziness, secrecy, and spiritual darkness. And what they say is very telling of their ignorance of God's power and character. They say, "The Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land." But of course, God does see them, and even a mere son of man like Ezekiel sees them. In Psalm 139, David reflects on the fact that God knows all things. He says, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways. If I say, 'Surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night,' even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you." To put it very concisely, God knows all things, period. There is no such thing as secret sin. There is no such thing as a secret thought. Nothing escapes his notice. And so this shows just how far the elders of Israel, the very people who should have been the most wise among the people, have been ignorant concerning the things of the knowledge of God. Well, let's continue reading now in verses 14 and 15. It says, "Then he brought me to the entrance of the north gate of the house of the Lord, and behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz. Then he said to me, 'Have you seen this, O son of man? You will see still greater abominations than these.'" So now Ezekiel sees the women of Jerusalem engaged in the ritual act of mourning for this god named Tammuz. One commentator explains what this means. He says, quote, "Weeping for Tammuz was a Babylonian ritual, marking the death and descent into the underworld of the god Dumuzi, whose mythological death and resurrection was thought to be parallel to the annual rhythm of nature. The cultic act of mourning was believed to counteract the loss of power of new life, thus hastening the return of fertility. So for an agrarian society like ancient Israel, the yearly growth of crops was everything. It could mean the difference between life and death. And that's why droughts were such cataclysmic events in the ancient world. And so when the people of Judah began to lose their faith in the God of all creation, they then started looking to other lesser gods for their protection and provision, even if they were the very gods of the people who were oppressing them. So that's what's going on at the north gate of the temple. But then look at what's going on there in verse 16. It says, "And he brought me into the inner court of the house of the Lord, and behold, at the entrance of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men, with their backs to the temple of the Lord, and their faces toward the east, worshiping the sun toward the east." Now, we are not told the identity of these 25 men, but we could infer that because they're between the porch and the altar of the temple, they must be priests. And what are these priests of the temple doing but turning their backs on the temple itself and bowing down to worship the sun in the sky above? They weren't even doing it in secret like the elders. They were doing it in broad daylight. And so, as we look over the whole of chapter 8, the point seems to be that the entirety of Judah's society, represented by the elders, the women, and the priests, is steeped in idolatry. It is pervasive and it is blatant. Therefore, the entire city of Jerusalem is going to be condemned by God. So what is corrupt worship? Well, you can know it immediately by finding out the object of that worship. If the object is anything or anyone other than the God of the Bible, then it is not true worship. While God does care about the manner of our worship, He cares about all the details, He cares much more about who or what we're worshiping. Nowadays, at least in Western society, most people aren't bowing down to statues of weird creatures or making sacrifices to the sun god or anything as blatant as all that. But we do idolize ourselves. We place ourselves at the center of the universe in our thoughts, our affections, and our actions. We live in a very self-obsessed culture. And just browse through social media or walk into any bookstore, and you'll see lots and lots of content that's geared toward self-transformation, self-help, self-care, self-healing, and even do-it-yourself religion. And that almost obsessive focus on the self seeps into other areas of life, including our politics. It results in what we call today identity politics. It seems that everyone now feels like they need to identify themselves in some way. I'm a Democrat. I'm a Republican. I'm a neoconservative. I'm a liberal. I'm a Christian nationalist. I'm a secularist. I'm a this. I'm a that. It's all focused on our own particular identities and whether or not those in our own little chosen community can gain dominance over every other community. The idolatry of our day is not the carving of idols or the bowing down to celestial bodies. It's the worship of the self and whatever tribe the self is part of. And so I say all that just to remind us that none of us is off the hook when it comes to the judgment that's rendered against idol worship when we see it displayed here in Ezekiel. All human beings are inclined to idol worship of some sort. Outside of the transforming power of Christ, that's what we're all naturally going to do. That's the most distinctive part of humanity's fallenness. Paul wrote about this in the first chapter of Romans, describing the predicament of all humanity. He writes, "For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator." The entire history of fallen humanity is one big story about idolatry in a multitude of forms. And notice from what Paul says in Romans that the natural tendency of a human being is it's to worship something. Even if that something isn't a god. It's going to be some object or objects within the world, including your very self. So the question is not whether you worship, but which person or thing you choose to worship. Well, as we move on now to the last point, the consequences of corrupt worship, we see God's response to all this starting in verses 17 and 18. It says, "Then he said to me, 'Have you seen this, O son of man? Is it too light a thing for the house of Judah to commit the abominations that they commit here, that they should fill the land with violence and provoke me still further to anger? Behold, they put the branch to their nose. Therefore I will act in wrath. My eye will not spare, nor will I have pity. And though they cry in my ears with a loud voice, I will not hear them.'" God will tolerate sin and rebellion for a certain amount of time, but he will not tolerate it forever. He does not wish that any should perish in their sin. But if a person or a people persist in their sin without repentance, then his just wrath will be poured out. Like the sin of the Canaanites reaching its fullness, just as God had promised to Abraham many generations before, the sin of the Israelites had just about come to the point of its fullness. And as we look at the description of God's judgment on them in chapter 9, that is a very apt analogy to keep in mind. It's as if the Israelites had strayed so far into the idolatry of Canaan that they had finally become the Canaanites. So just as God had the Israelites purge the land of the Canaanites in the time of Joshua, he was now going to have the Babylonians purge the land of the Israelites in Ezekiel's time. Well, let's move on now to chapter 9. And as we do so, let's bring to mind again our Charles Dickens analogy. Ezekiel was being shown what was going on at the present time in chapter 8. But in chapter 9, he's going to be shown what is yet to happen and may not happen. So in chapter 8, Ghost of Christmas Past. Chapter 9, Ghost of Christmas Future. So let's read now verses 1 and 2 in chapter 9. It says, "Then he cried in my ears with a loud voice, saying, 'Bring near the executioners of the city, each with his destroying weapon in his hand.' And behold, 6 men came from the direction of the upper gate, which faces north, each with his weapon for slaughter in his hand. And with them was a man clothed in linen, with a writing case at his waist. And they went in and stood beside the bronze altar." So first of all, we need to keep in mind that this is a vision that Ezekiel is having. So we shouldn't expect this to be a literal prophecy of what Jerusalem's fall is going to look like. As a matter of fact, we know that in a few years from this point, the Babylonian army will come and lay siege on Jerusalem. And after several months, the city will fall, and the Babylonians will either kill or enslave all the inhabitants. That means that we should see these 6 executioners and also this 7th figure that's mentioned with the writing case to be symbolic of God's act of judgment, not an exact description of what it's going to look like. And the identity of these individuals is somewhat ambiguous. The 6 are called executioners, and they have weapons of execution. But that's all that we know about them. So could these be angels or could they be human beings? We don't know. And for the sake of the vision, it really isn't all that important that we know. They're simply representatives of God's agents of judgment. But just before that act of final judgment would happen, God would withdraw his protective presence from the land. We'll see that happen definitively when we look at chapter 10 next week, God willing. But we already see hints of that in these chapters today. In verse 6 of chapter 8, God said, "Son of man, do you see what they are doing? The great abominations that the house of Israel are committing here, to drive me far from my sanctuary." And then look at what happens here in chapter 9 in the first part of verse 3. It says, "Now the glory of the God of Israel had gone up from the cherub on which it rested to the threshold of the house." So let's make sure that we're clear about what this means. The glory of God that Ezekiel sees in his visions is the chariot throne of God. It's that crazy looking thing that we saw in chapter 1 that has wheels within wheels and the cherubim angels stationed at its 4 corners. When Ezekiel first arrives at Jerusalem in this vision, he sees the manifestation of God's glory just above the temple where it belongs. The temple was meant to be the focal point of God's presence to his people. And after the time of the tabernacle, it was meant to be the permanent focal point. It was supposed to be tied to that land, to that particular city. Now, of course, devout Jews knew that God was not confined to a temple. He was the God of the world, not just the God of Israel. To use the more modern term, he was understood to be omnipresent. Nevertheless, the temple was thought to be the designated place to meet with God, to worship God, and to make sacrifices to God. But already God is giving Ezekiel hints here that God's presence is not always going to be attached to the temple. So in verse 3, we see that the glory of God moves from above the cherub. And what's most likely referring to there is one of the carved cherub figures that were on top of the Ark of the Covenant. In other words, God's presence was hovering just above the spot in the temple that housed the Ark of the Covenant. But then Ezekiel sees it move from above the Holy of Holies over to the threshold of the temple. Not a very long distance to travel, but it is an initial indicator that God is not going to abide with a sinful people forever. As we'll see, God was getting ready to remove his hand of protection. Well, let's continue reading now in the second part of verse 3 through verse 7. So chapter 9, second part of verse 3 through verse 7. And he called to the man clothed in linen who had the writing case at his waist. And the Lord said to him, "Pass through the city, through Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and groan over all the abominations that are committed in it." And to the others he said in my hearing, "Pass through the city after him and strike. Your eyes shall not spare, and you shall show no pity. Kill old men outright, young men and maidens, little children and women, but touch no one on whom is the mark, and begin at my sanctuary." So they began with the elders who were before the house. Then he said to them, "Defile the house and fill the courts with the slain. Go out." So they went out and struck at the city. And while they were striking and I was left alone, I fell upon my face and cried, "Ah, Lord God, will you destroy all the remnant of Israel in the outpouring of your wrath on Jerusalem?" So as we've already seen, the nature of the seventh man that's mentioned along with the executioners is quite distinct. He's not an executioner. He doesn't even carry a weapon. Instead, he's dressed in linen, which was typically the clothing of a priest. And he carries with him a writing case on his waist. This figure, whether he's supposed to be a human being or an angel, is meant to represent God's protection over those who have been given a special mark on their foreheads. And we'll come back to that. But right now, we need to acknowledge just how horrifying this scene of judgment is. The executioners are to have no mercy on anyone who does not have the protective mark, whether they be old or young, men or women, adults or children. Now, to us, that probably seems extremely cruel. And while we shouldn't try to take away the shock value of this passage, we should keep in mind at least a few things. Number one, this is a reflection of the devastation that would actually happen when the Babylonians captured Jerusalem. They wouldn't completely annihilate the population, but they would have very little mercy for anyone within the city walls. They were there to conquer and to pillage. The second thing to note is the precise kind of language that God uses. He uses the words like utter destruction of the people. For devout Jews who knew their history well, they would immediately recognize that language to be taken almost directly from the command of God to Joshua to utterly slay the Canaanites. So once again, this highlights the terrible reality that Israel had basically become Canaan. Therefore, they would suffer the same kind of judgment as Canaan. And then thirdly, this is meant to be a symbolic description of God's ultimate justice. In other words, it's a judgment that is both full and final. For the Israelites of Ezekiel's time, that means that God would give the Babylonians free rein to decimate his holy city, including the temple. But even that act of judgment can point to an even greater, more final act of judgment to come. In the Gospels, Jesus repeatedly warns people of the final day of judgment. The day after Jesus' return, when God will separate the sheep from the goats, and then those whose names are not in the book of life will be thrown into the lake of fire. So this scene of judgment that we read about in chapter 9 is not just meant to give a sober mind to the remaining Israelites of that time, but also to give a sober mind to all of us as well. Our idolatry, whether it be the worship of ourselves or our possessions or our country or our family, is an idolatry that's no less worthy of judgment than that of the Israelites. But it doesn't have to be that way. Notice earlier in that passage that we just read who gets the protective mark on their foreheads. It's not simply an arbitrary choice, but rather it's given to those who sigh and grieve over their sin. In other words, it's given to those who repent before it's too late. It's given to those who turn back to God and forsake their sinful ways. Just as we saw in our passage last week, God always keeps a remnant of his people who remain faithful to him. And so the point of this passage is not to ask ourselves the question, do I have God's protective mark or do I not? But rather, am I living a life of repentance? Am I living a life that is devoted to Christ, despite my occasional sinful actions? Do you want to worship God rightly? Well, then devote your entire self to him. To quote the Apostle Paul one more time, he says at the beginning of Romans 12, and we all know this verse, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. True worship has less to do with the type of instruments that are used or the type of music or even the quality of the music. True worship springs from the heart of one who is utterly devoted to God, one who is willing to give their very life to God as their spiritual sacrifice. Everything else flows out from that. So may we seek him and him alone and forsake all false substitutes.